When Eleanor Pike walked into the Blackthorn Valley Improvement Company office, Ambrose Vane gave her 3 days to disappear. By Friday morning, he said, his riders would cross her fence line, inventory every tool, every barrel, every crate in the smokehouse, and take the farm as company property. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She did not beg. She looked at the deed lying open on his desk, let her eyes travel to the county seal, and said the one thing Ambrose Vane did not expect a grieving widow to say. That seal was cut from the replacement die issued in 1887. The transfer you filed is dated 1879. That was the first moment Ambrose Vane truly looked at her. He had the smooth face of a man who had never lifted anything heavier than inherited power. Soft cheeks, cold eyes, clean cuffs, perfect calm. Men like that were dangerous because they mistook comfort for proof that God agreed with them. "You have until Friday," he repeated. Eleanor held his gaze another heartbeat, then turned and left with the taste of iron in her mouth, and the knowledge that Sam had not died in time for Blackthorn's liking. Outside, late October light was sliding across the Cumberland Plateau, all red clay roads and gold hickory leaves, and long blue hills folding into one another toward the west. Slate Run lay below the company office like a painting made to trick decent people into trusting the place. Smoke curled from chimneys. The creek flashed silver between sycamores. Apple trees along the lower slope still carried the last stubborn fruit. The valley was beautiful. That was the insult of it. 6 years earlier, when Samuel Pike brought her here as his bride, Eleanor had thought the whole country looked honest. Not easy, never easy, but honest. Orchard rose on the south field, chestnut and hickory on the upper rise. A stone farmhouse set against a low ridge as if the hill had decided to shelter it. Sam walking the boundary line with that loose, easy stride of a man who loved the ground beneath him and trusted it to love him back. Now Sam was dead 18 days, and the Seine Valley had put a forged deed in Ambrose Vane's hand. Samuel Pike had been 39 years old, and hard to imagine lying still. He was one of those men whose strength looked cheerful instead of theatrical. He split rails because rails needed splitting, hauled feed because animals needed feed, and came in at dusk, smelling of cold earth, horse sweat, cedar bark, and the sweet damp scent of apples stored for winter. He had no patience for laziness, no talent for deceit, and no weakness except the dangerous habit of believing that straightforward men lived in a mostly straightforward world. The fever had taken him too fast. That was what the doctor said. Too fast. River ague, perhaps. Tainted water, perhaps. A hard chill turned wrong, perhaps. Too many perhapses for a woman who had been trained never to accept maybe when evidence could be found. On Sam's first day ill, he said only that he felt dragged out. On the second, the heat in his skin was frightening, his pulse fast and wrong. On the third, he was speaking through a fog Eleanor could not enter. Once, near sundown, he gripped her wrist with a strength that should not have remained in a dying man and whispered, "Survey drawer. Quarry cabin." She had thought it was fever speech. Now, rolling down the ridge road in their wagon with Blackthorn's deadline behind her, she was no longer sure. Eleanor had not been raised for farm life. She had been raised around records. Her mother, Lydia Rowan, spent 21 years in Nashville working first as a copying clerk in a title office, then as the woman wealthy men quietly hired when they suspected that another wealthy man had altered a probate filing, changed a boundary line, or manufactured a debt against the dead. Lydia taught Eleanor to notice pressure marks in signatures before she taught her to hem a cuff properly. She taught her that paper lied less often than people, but only if someone knew how to question it. When Eleanor was 9, Lydia laid 2 probate certificates on the kitchen table and told her to find the false one. For nearly an hour Eleanor saw nothing.
Then she noticed the lower loop of the county clerk's final letter. In one document, the pen rose naturally at the turn. In the other, the line thickened the fraction where a copyist had slowed and pressed harder. That tiny hesitation told the whole story. Forgery lives in the places where certainty has to pretend to be effortless, Lydia said. Eleanor never forgot it. She met Sam Pike at a livestock exhibition outside Murfreesboro when she was 28 and visiting cousins for a week she had intended to find dull. Sam had entered a pair of mules and lost to a man who cheated on the weight sheet. Most men would have cursed or swung. Sam laughed, pointed out the altered numbers, and then spent half an hour asking Eleanor how she had spotted the same discrepancy before he did. He listened the way curious people listen, with their full mind, not just their face. He loved that she verified everything. She loved that he never asked her to be smaller than she was. After their wedding, Eleanor read every inheritance record tied to the Pike place. She indexed copies in a stiff leather deed case with dividers she cut herself, each section marked by date, type, and county of issue. Sam joked that if lightning ever struck the house, she would save him first and the deed case second. She told him he should feel honored to rank above the case at all. Now the leather case sat under the wagon bench beside her, and the man who once laughed at it lay in the churchyard on the ridge. By the time Eleanor reached the farmhouse, the afternoon light had gone honey-colored.
The house was exactly where she had left it that morning. Gray stone, dark roof, porch posts Sam had replaced the previous spring. Yet everything about it felt precarious, as if Blackthorn's paper had already begun erasing the weight of the walls. She unsaddled the mare, fed the mule, and went inside. Sam's cup still sat on the kitchen shelf where she had placed it after the funeral. His work gloves hung by the back door. His half-repaired pruning hook rested on the table beside the window. Grief was not dramatic in that room. It was domestic. It lived in ordinary objects, continuing to wait for someone who would not return. Eleanor sat in Sam's chair and replayed Ambrose Vane's face when she mentioned the seal. He had not looked frightened. He had looked irritated, which meant he thought the evidence would not matter. That was the more dangerous thing. The next morning, Eleanor walked to Harlan Mote's store at the crossroads, bought lamp oil and salt, and asked the question people in Slate Run had trained themselves not to hear. Who lost land to Blackthorn before us? Harlan Mote was 68, missing 2 fingertips from a saw accident, and had lived long enough in one valley to mistake repetition for inevitability. He wrapped her salt in brown paper, kept his eyes on the counter, and said, "Depends how far back you mean. Far enough to find the pattern." His hands stopped. Outside, wagons creaked. Someone laughed near the hitch rail. The stove in the back room settled with a low metal pop. "The Brannons lost 80 acres after the war," Harlan said at last. "The Lesters lost their mill in 81. Widow Caro signed something she swore she never signed. The company won anyway. Because the papers were real?" Eleanor asked. Harlan looked toward the window, toward the road, toward every place except her face. Because nobody with standing wanted to challenge them. It was not an answer, which told Eleanor everything. From the store she rode to Ruth Haley's place half a mile south of the creek. Ruth was 42, mother of 4, sharp as frost, and the nearest thing Eleanor had to a sister in Slate Run. They had traded preserves, sat up through births and sickness, and once spent half a night dragging a calf out of a ditch in the rain while their husbands laughed from the barn door and pretended not to be impressed. Ruth listened with both hands wrapped around a mug of chicory coffee gone cold. Eleanor did not ask her to testify. She asked something smaller, and, in its way, crueler. "If they come for the house," Eleanor said, "will you keep a copy of the Pike title papers? Just long enough that I know they cannot take every version." Ruth's face tightened before she answered. "My husband works Blackthorn timber in winter," she said quietly. "If they hear I hid papers against them, they cut him off, and then my children eat fear for supper." Eleanor nodded once. She had expected refusal. What she had not expected was Ruth's next sentence. "Ellie, Listen to me before you hate me for it. I do not know that you are right. You lost Sam less than 3 weeks ago. A mind can lean toward blame when grief has nowhere else to go. The words hurt, because they touched the one possibility Eleanor had tried not to name. What if she was wrong? What if sorrow had sharpened suspicion past truth? She rode home without speaking to anyone else. Sunset laid copper across the creek. Leaves spun down through the orchard rows. The whole valley looked like a promise someone had already broken. That night Eleanor opened the deed case and laid every paper across the dining table. She lit 2 oil lamps and angled them low to catch wax and embossing. Her mother had taught her never to study seals under a single light. A bad angle made honest impressions look suspicious and false impressions look clean. She worked without haste. First the original Pike deed transfer from Sam's grandfather. Then tax receipts. Then probate abstracts. Then the new blackthorn filing Ambrose Vane had placed so casually on his desk, claiming the Pike acreage had been surrendered 13 years earlier against an ancestral debt no living man could verify. Eleanor compared dates, signatures, clerk initials, witness placements, the width of pen nibs, the cut of the county seal. At first she found only what she already knew, the seal mismatch. Useful, but arguable. A skilled attorney could claim an older document had been re-registered later. Then, near midnight, she found the thing that cracked the whole filing open. The transfer had been certified by Justice Abram Sorrell. Abram Sorrell had been dead 9 years before the stated certification date. Not retired. Not moved away. Dead. Eleanor sat back and stared at the line until her eyes burned. Outside, the wind moved through the bare upper branches above the roof with a dry, rushing sound like paper being handled in a dark room. She had proof. Not suspicion. Not grief. Proof. At dawn they came anyway. 6 company riders. 2 wagons. Sheriff Cyrus Bell at the front with a folded order in his hand and his badge catching the weak light. The men moved with the efficient indifference of people paid to treat a house like inventory. Sheriff Bell handed her a new notice. Expanded seizure. Immediate occupancy termination. Blackthorn property protection order. Eleanor was to leave not only the Pike farm but a 20-mile radius around Slate Run by Sunday evening. If found within that boundary afterward, she could be jailed for trespass against company land. What you have is forged, she said. Bell's jaw worked once. He kept his eyes on the paper. What I have is the order I'm required to serve. He did not deny it. That was as close to honesty as she was going to get. Eleanor packed with mechanical calm. 2 dresses, 1 wool coat, dried beef, hard biscuits, canteen, skinning knife, spare stockings, magnifier, lamp matches, Sam's pocket compass, and the leather deed case. She would have left then if not for one small catch of her thumb on the underside of the case lid. A seam. Not part of the original leatherwork. She cut it open with the skinning knife and found a flattened pocket stitched inside the lining. Inside the pocket lay a narrow iron key and a torn slip in Sam's hand. Lower drawer. Survey table. Hoary cabin above Slate Run. For 1 second the kitchen seemed to tilt. Sam had not been delirious. He had been trying to send her somewhere. Eleanor waited until the wagons moved toward the barn, and the company men scattered to begin their inventory. Then she led the mare through the back lot, crossed the creek at the shallow ford, and took the old logging path west toward the high ground. The quarry cabin sat 3 miles up a slope nobody used anymore, abandoned after the slate works failed. By noon she found it, half-collapsed porch, roof patched with mismatched shingles, 1 window boarded, 1 broken. Inside stood an old survey table covered in dust. The lower drawer was locked. Sam's key turned easily. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, were copied ledger pages and another note. Ellie, if this reaches you before I can explain, it means matters ran quicker than I thought. These pages came from Martin. Do not trust the road east. If Blackthorn knows what I have, they will not stop at the land. She read the note twice, then opened the copied pages. Entries from Blackthorn's private ledgers. Dates, acreage, payment records, seizure schedules. Internal notations in a clerk's hand. The language was dry, which made it monstrous. Widow non-compliant. Delay filing until after burial. Secure sheriff cooperation before notice. Eleanor leaned one hand on the table until the room steadied. Sam had been investigating them. And Sam had died before he could tell her. Martin Pike was Sam's second cousin, a former Blackthorn Records clerk, dismissed the previous spring. Sam had said only that Martin looked half-starved by worry and asked too many questions for a company man. Now Eleanor knew why. She also understood one more thing. If Blackthorn already suspected Sam, the house and the roads would be watched. The obvious route east toward the county seat was closed. South ran through company timber camps. North crossed leased land. West climbed into the rough country above Slate Run, where only hunters and fools went after October. So Eleanor went west. Not because it was wise. Because it was the direction Blackthorn considered impossible. By dusk she was in laurel thickets and broken shale, leading the mare where the slope grew too steep to ride. By full dark she had to turn the mare loose. The animal would find pasture or another farm on its own. Taking her higher would only leave tracks anyone could read. Eleanor strapped the deed case across her back with harness leather, tucked the oilskin pages beneath her coat, and climbed. At some hour that felt closer to midnight than reason, her left foot landed on a slick root, rolled, and sent her hard into mud and wet leaves. For a long moment she could not breathe. The night above the trees was absolute. No farmhouse light, no road, no bell, just black timber and the cold smell of rot. Her ankle throbbed. Her back ached where the deed case had driven into her spine. And for the first time since leaving the house, fear came in its full size. Not fear of Blackthorn. Fear that Ruth had been right. Fear that she had mistaken grief for pattern, fever for murder, forged paper for coincidence, and was now alone on a mountain, carrying old documents toward a death nobody would bother to explain. She lay there and let the thought reach its full weight. Then, because Lydia Rowan had trained her better than panic, Eleanor examined the evidence. Abram Sorrell, dead 9 years before certification. Replacement seal die used on an earlier filing. Sam's hidden key. Sam's copy pages. Facts did not improve because she believed them. They did not weaken because she was exhausted. Eleanor pushed herself upright. The ankle was sprained, not broken. That distinction was enough. At dawn she reached the spine of the ridge and saw the place Sam had once mentioned only in passing. An old forestry survey tower above Iron Spur, stone-walled and half-roofed, abandoned long before she came to Slate Run. He said his grandfather used to shelter there during storm watches, and that from its upper platform you could see trouble coming before trouble saw you. The tower stood in a small valley of pine and scrub oak, one corner split by a long crack from roofline to foundation. Empty window openings stared over the slope like blind eyes. Inside, the lower rooms smelled of dust, damp stone, and mouse nests. Broken slats littered the dirt floor. A narrow stair climbed to an upper chamber where part of the roof still held. In one sheltered corner sat a cedar chest with a rusted hasp. Eleanor broke the hasp with a survey hammer she found downstairs and lifted the lid. Inside were moth-eaten blankets, an oiled hunting knife, and a ledger journal wrapped in cloth. The first page read, Gideon Hale Field Auditor, Cumberland Mineral and Land, April 1868. Eleanor sat on the stone sleeping ledge and began to read. At first the entries were routine. Acreage assessments, rent tallies, transport costs. Then, over weeks, the tone changed. Hale had discovered duplicate books. Public ledgers for county review. Private ledgers for the directors. Private set recorded what the public one concealed. Manufactured debts, forged inheritances, falsified liens, properties seized from families who lacked copies or lawyers or both. 12 farms, 2 mills, a tanyard, a widow's orchard, a blacksmith shop, 1 mountain quarry later sold at triple value. Next to several names, margin notes in another hand. Move before winter. Husband ill. Delay challenge. No male petitioner remains. Eleanor stopped on that line and felt the air leave her chest. No male petitioner remains. A sentence written like bookkeeping. A man's disappearance reduced to administrative convenience. The later entries grew urgent. Hale had copied pages, written affidavits, and hidden them because he believed the company director knew he was preparing to take them to federal authorities. His final entry gave directions. Iron box under the hearth, 3 spans north of center. If found by an honest party, take all papers to a federal judge. Do not trust county officers. Eleanor went to the hearth immediately. The floor there was hard-packed, but not uniform. 3 spans north of center, the wood handle of the broken hammer struck a hollow note. It took half an hour of clawing dirt and levering stone before she dragged free a small iron strongbox sealed long ago with wax now brittle as old bone. Inside were copied ledgers, sworn letters, and 1 packet of correspondence tied with faded ribbon. Eleanor laid Hale's evidence beside Sam's oilskin pages. Hale documented 1848 through 1868. Sam's copies documented 1889 through 1892. Different decades. Same method. Same family signatures. Same notes in the margins. Colder now because repetition had made the crime efficient. 3 generations of Vanes had been stealing land with the confidence of people who no longer bothered to invent a new lie. Eleanor understood 2 things at once. She now held enough to destroy Blackthorn Valley Improvement Company. And 2 men before her had gotten close to this same truth and vanished. Gideon Hale in the records, Sam in the churchyard. That afternoon, hoofbeats sounded on the ridge trail. Eleanor buried the papers beneath loose stone under the stair, killed the tiny warming fire she had made, and pressed herself into the crack between the stairwell and north wall with Hale's knife in one hand and her skinning blade in the other. The riders passed. Not travelers. Searchers, moving slow, listening. When the sound faded, she stayed hidden another full 10 minutes. The next morning another horse came, only one this time, descending the creek trail in starts and pauses as if the rider were reading sign on the ground. A man in his middle 50s, spare-built, weathered, with a federal cut coat gone shiny at the elbows. He dismounted below the tower and entered. A minute later he came back outside, stood very still, and looked at the disturbed hearth. Eleanor watched from above him on a granite outcrop. He said, "You're looking for Gideon Hale's papers." The man turned sharply, but did not reach for the revolver at his hip. "Who are you?" "Eleanor Pike, Samuel Pike's widow. I have them." His face changed in stages, suspicion, recognition, then the hard, controlled relief of a man who had spent too long expecting disappointment. "My name is Jonas Creed," he said, "Deputy United States Marshal, Knoxville Circuit. Gideon Hale was my first superior." He showed her his commission papers, a brass badge, and a folded letter from 1874 signed by Hale. Eleanor compared the handwriting against the letters from the strongbox. Same angular capitals, same clipped lower loops, same habit of crossing a long T with a short stroke and a short T with an overlong one. Evidence first, trust later. Jonas studied the papers once she brought them out, and understood what she had already understood. Blackthorn's done this across 40 years, he said. Closer to 50. I've tried to pin the veins twice. Without originals, the county men laughed me back over the line. You're not laughing now. No, ma'am. By noon he was urging speed. He knew a federal clerk in Knoxville who could authenticate old records and place them before a circuit judge if they reached the city fast enough. Then we go together, Eleanor said. You hand me the papers, and I ride faster. No. His expression changed, not to anger, but to an old reflex. The reflex of a man accustomed to authority shortening difficult conversations. Mrs. Pike. My husband is dead, Mr. Creed, possibly because of what is in this case. I carried it here. I will carry it out. Something in her tone ended the discussion. They left the tower by the lower trail, with Eleanor mounted behind Jonas on his bay gelding, the deed case wedged between them, Hale's papers bundled under her coat with Sam's oilskin packet. Jonas rode east first, then cut south by an old charcoal road, trying to avoid the main approaches to Slate Run. He spoke little. When he did, he gave facts. Which counties Blackthorn controlled, which judges were friendly to company counsel, which deputy clerks still remembered Gideon Hale's disappearance and stopped speaking when his name came up. He also told her that Ambrose Vane's son, Julian, handled most of the legal work now. The father inherited greed, Jonas said. The son improved the machinery. Near dusk on the second day, they reached a river road and saw the trap too late. 2 wagons across the track, 3 mounted men behind them. Blackthorn insignia burned into both tailboards. Jonas reined hard. Off, he said. I am not leaving. Into the trees north. Now. She slid from the horse, the deed case already on her back. If they take me alone, he said without looking at her, I live long enough to be troublesome. If they take you with those papers, this ends here. She hesitated one fatal second. Jonas turned then, and whatever she saw in his face ended argument. Not heroics. Mathematics. Go or lose everything. Eleanor ran. She heard the men shout. Heard one of them order Jonas down. Heard Jonas say, voice level as if announcing weather, I am a federal officer, and you are obstructing a federal investigation. Then the sound of a blow. Then another. She kept running. One rider came after her through the timber. Heavier than she was, faster on flat ground, worse on steep shale. Eleanor cut uphill through laurel, found a slip between 2 boulders half hidden by fern and pine roots, and flattened herself into it, with the deed case pressed to her ribs. The man stopped so near she could hear his breathing. Mud on boots. Spurs clicking. Revolver leather creaking when he shifted. For 30 seconds that lasted a year, he scanned the slope. Then he moved away. Eleanor stayed in the gap until silence returned in layers. First no footsteps, then no horse, then the ordinary insect and leaf noise of a mountain deciding she had not died there after all. When she finally crawled free, she sat with her back to the rock and wept. For Jonas, who had stepped into pain because he understood what the papers were worth. For Sam, who had hidden evidence and died before he could hand it over. For the names in Hale's ledgers reduced to transactions. And when the tears ended, something colder replaced them. Not grief, not panic. Purpose stripped down to its hardest form. She checked the papers. Dry. Intact. Then she walked. For 2 days Eleanor moved by deer trace, creek bed, and wagon road, eating sparingly, sleeping little, keeping away from any place where a company rider might ask questions. On the second morning she studied Sam's oilskin packet again while hiding behind a stone fence near a small depot village. That was when she found the letter she had missed. Sam, I am sending the copied pages because you are the only man I trust. I beg you not to use them unless there is no other way. If Blackthorn learns they came through me, My wife and little girl will pay for it. Burn this after reading. Martin. Eleanor sat very still after that. Martin Pike had risked everything already. Sam had kept the letter. Now she carried evidence that could free dozens of families and ruin the one man who had supplied it. Truth, she thought, was simple only to people who never had to carry it far enough. By evening she reached Knoxville on a third-class rail ticket bought with the last greenback she had sewn into her hem. The city smelled of coal, hot iron, and river damp. Government buildings stood shoulder to shoulder with law offices. Power here was conducted indoors, under lamps, in rooms where men called theft procedure and believed the right stationery purified it. Jonas had named the clerk she must find. Owen Kendrick, Federal Records Examiner. Gay Street, 1, narrow-faced, ink-stained, and looked at people the way other men looked at documents, suspicious until proven useful. He listened without interrupting, then took the papers one by one. He checked the paper stock, the oxidation of ink, the cut of county stamps, the witness formulas used in different decades, the Hale Journal, Sam's copies, the dead justice's certification. At last he looked up. Mrs. Pike, this is the strongest chain of documentary fraud I have seen in my office. Then you can help me. He did not answer immediately, which made her think for one sick moment that he would refuse. Instead, he said, the district judge is still in session through tomorrow. If we move tonight, he can issue an emergency injunction before Blackthorn buries half the trail. And Jonas Creed. If he is being held by subjects of a federal fraud petition, the judge can order immediate recovery. For the first time since Ambrose Vane set the deadline, Eleanor felt the world shift, slightly, not kindly, but measurably, toward the possibility of justice. Judge Nathaniel Porter received them after dark in his chambers, robe still on, supper cooling untouched on a side table. A shorthand clerk sat near the wall. Kendrick stood beside Eleanor. The fire in the grate burned low. For 90 minutes she presented the case. No dramatics, no guesses, no speeches where facts would do. Lydia Rowan had taught her that evidence should never be forced to wear emotion's clothes. Let it arrive in its own authority. Eleanor laid out the forged Pike transfer, the dead justice's certification, Hale's journal, the buried ledgers, Sam's copied pages, and the internal notes proving Blackthorn's pattern across decades. Judge Porter asked the right questions, which was another way of saying he was dangerous to liars. When she finished, he placed one finger on the Hale journal and said, if these materials are authentic, this company has not merely stolen land, it has built itself on a continuing criminal structure. They are authentic, Kendrick said. Porter nodded once. Then by morning I will sign an injunction freezing Blackthorn Valley Improvement Company's contested holdings pending hearing. I will also issue recovery authority for Deputy Marshal Creed. There is one more matter, Kendrick said. Blackthorn's principal advocate will be Julian Vane. The judge's eyes moved back to Eleanor. He is able counsel, Porter said. Do you understand what that means? It means I should be more exact than he is smooth. A faint line touched the judge's mouth, not a smile exactly, but respect deciding it had found a place to sit. The next morning Eleanor met Adelaide Crowe at the Lamar House Hotel. Adelaide was 47, widowed, impeccably dressed in dark silk and practical boots, owner once of a grain mill that Blackthorn had seized 4 years earlier through a forged debt settlement. Spent thousands in futile state litigation and learned the hard way that local law was only law when local power allowed it to be. She listened to Eleanor's summary without wasting a breath on sympathy. How old are you? Adelaide asked. 34. I have been fighting them for years. You've arrived in Knoxville with enough paper to crack their foundation in 4 days. That is either providence or unacceptable delay. I'm not here for providence. Good. Neither am I. By noon Adelaide had engaged Rutherford Voss, the sharpest federal litigator she could afford. He reviewed the evidence, approved the petition, then found the problem Eleanor already knew was waiting. "These copied company pages from Sam Pike's packet," he said. "If the court presses for source, refusal may weaken admissibility. The source has a wife and child. I understand the moral concern. It is not a concern. It is a fact." Voss held her gaze, then nodded. "Very well. We proceed as far as the other evidence takes us. If the question comes, you choose." By Friday morning Jonas Creed had been recovered by federal deputies. He came in with one eye bruised dark, ribs bound tight beneath his coat, and the steady composure of a man too stubborn to let pain rearrange his priorities. "The papers made it?" he asked. "They made it. Then the rest is bookkeeping." He also brought intelligence. During his confinement in a feed shed on company property, he heard enough to confirm what the papers implied. Ambrose Vane signed the thefts, but Julian engineered the timing, the filings, the witness pressure, the county cooperation. The father inherited appetite, Jonas said. The son made it efficient. That same morning a note was pushed under Eleanor's boarding house door. "Withdraw your lies or answer for the receipt of stolen property." No signature. She handed it directly to Judge Porter's clerk, who filed it as attempted witness intimidation without comment. Another message arrived by telegraph before noon from Ruth Halley in Slate Run. "Company men asked after you. Harlan told them you'd been questioning old land losses. He was frightened. I thought you should know." Eleanor was not angry at Harlan. Fear was Blackthorn's cheapest instrument and its most reliable one. She spent the last evening before the hearing the way Lydia would have wanted, not praying for victory, not rehearsing indignation, but reviewing every page again under good light until each fact sat in memory with the steadiness of a fence post set deep. The courtroom on hearing day was smaller than Eleanor expected and more crowded. Merchants, farmers, clerks, 2 newspaper men, curious ladies, bored young attorneys, and men from the valley who had come for spectacle and stayed for the chance to see power forced to explain itself. Ambrose Vane sat at the defense table in black broadcloth, immaculate and heavy-lidded. Beside him sat Julian Vane, 32. Clean-shaven. Perfect collar. Quiet hands. He did not look like a villain, which was precisely what made him effective. He looked like a reasonable man, here to defend order from hysteria. Rutherford Voss opened for the petitioners. Systematic fraud. Forged title transfer. Coercive displacement. Obstruction of a federal officer. Witness intimidation. Julian rose and answered, in a voice so calm. Half the room leaned toward him. He did not insult Eleanor. He refined her. A widow recently bereaved. Under understandable strain. Possibly overinterpreting irregular but harmless archival issues. Influenced by a federal officer, with a long personal grudge against Blackthorn. Relying on documents with uncertain chain of custody, found in abandoned places and handled outside normal procedure. He transformed her from a claimant into a question mark. That was his genius. Not attack. Doubt. Arranged so neatly it resembled fairness. Eleanor watched faces in the gallery change. Sympathy cooling into caution. Interest sliding toward suspicion. She understood then why men like Julian Vane were more dangerous than armed riders. Armed riders terrified you once. Men like Julian trained a room to distrust the truth, while feeling civilized for doing it. Jonas testified first. Julian pressed him on his 20-year pursuit of Blackthorn. Yes, Jonas said. I have pursued them that long. So you admit personal hostility. I admit persistence. And you were detained by men you now associate with my client. I was detained by men wearing your client's insignia, who demanded to know where Mrs. Pike had taken the papers. Jonas leaned slightly forward. They did not ask if she was unstable. They asked where the evidence was. Men do not beat a federal officer over documents they believe meaningless. The room shifted. Kendrick followed. Julian tried to cut at process rather than conclusions. Very clever. If he could not make the documents false, he could try to make authentication feel incomplete. Kendrick met each question with patient specificity. Paper stock consistent with date. Ink aging consistent with date. Seal wear consistent with county usage. Buried storage conditions, explaining preservation variance. The dead justice's name, impossible to reconcile with the stated certification year. Judge Porter asked only a few questions, but each one landed where it mattered. If these materials were hidden beneath a sealed hearth in an abandoned survey tower, he said, what credible avenue of modern tampering do you propose? Mr. Vane. Julian had no good answer, only elegant phrasing around uncertainty. Then came the moment Eleanor had known would arrive. Judge Porter lifted Sam's oilskin copies. Mrs. Pike, he said, the court requires the origin of these pages if it is to weigh them fully. Can you identify the source by which your husband obtained them? The room went still. Eleanor looked toward the rear benches, almost without meaning to. Martin Pike was there. She had not known whether he would come. Thin as a split rail. Pale. Hands clasped so hard the knuckles blanched. Fear had lived in his face for months and made a permanent home. Eleanor heard Voss inhale beside her. This was the point where principle became cost. If she named Martin, Julian could shred him. Blackthorn could ruin his family, and every frightened man in every crooked office would learn what honesty purchased. If she refused, the pages might be weakened. Judge Porter's voice remained neutral. Mrs. Pike. Eleanor swallowed once. My husband obtained those pages before his death. I found them among his hidden papers. As to the original source, Your Honor, I decline to name him at this time, because doing so may endanger the man and his family. Julian was standing before her last word ended. Your Honor, the petitioner cannot both rely on anonymous material and withhold the source from examination. I move that the pages be given no weight. Porter looked at Eleanor. Do you understand what your refusal may cost your case? Yes. Do you maintain it? She thought of Martin's letter. Of his daughter. Of Sam choosing not to burn it, because conscience and caution had collided in his hands, the same way they now collided in hers. Yes, Your Honor. I maintain it. Julian drew breath to press the advantage. A voice from the back of the courtroom cut across him. I am the source. Every head turned. Martin Pike rose from the last bench. He looked as if standing required all the courage left in his body. But once upright, he did not sit again. He walked down the center aisle with the slow, rigid steps of a man carrying fear so long it had become part of his posture. At the rail he faced the bench. I worked 6 years in Blackthorn's private records room, he said. I copied those pages before my dismissal. I gave them to Samuel Pike because I believed he might know what to do with them. And then I begged him not to use them, because I was afraid for my wife and my little girl. His voice shook once. Then steadied. Samuel died. I remained silent. Mrs. Pike has not spoken my name, even to save her own case. I will not let her carry what I was too frightened to carry myself. From inside his coat, he drew a second packet. Original clerk duplicates. Different paper. Different ink. Same entries. And on the bottom of the most important pages, authorizing signature after authorizing signature in Ambrose Vane's own hand. A sound moved through the courtroom. Not speech, not gasping exactly, but the sound a room makes when denial loses its balance. Julian looked at his father. For the first time all day, Ambrose Vane did not meet another man's eyes. He looked down. That was when Eleanor knew the case had broken. There are moments in law when the verdict arrives before the words do. Present understands it, though formality still has work to perform. Judge Porter called a short recess. When court resumed, Julian Vane approached the bench with a face carefully composed into the shape men use when trying to negotiate the terms of a collapse. It did not help him. By late afternoon, the ruling came. Emergency petition granted. Blackthorn Valley Improvement Company placed under federal receivership pending criminal proceedings. Ambrose Vane, to be held for fraud, conspiracy, and interference with federal process. All lands acquired under the fraudulent filings, to be restored to their lawful owners or heirs upon review. Deputy Marshal Creed's detention entered as evidence of obstruction. And in language Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life, the court recognized the direct standing of a widow to petition on property fraud connected to her household and inheritance, without mandatory dependence on a male co-claimant. The room did not erupt. Real victory in a courtroom seldom looks like theater. It looks like people sitting very still, while the shape of power changes in front of them, and they are not yet ready to trust what they heard. Eleanor stayed seated. She did not feel triumph. She felt astonishment. That the facts had held. That Sam had been right to hide them. That Lydia had been right to teach her. That order, arranged carefully enough, could outweigh money for at least one day in Tennessee. Martin approached first. "Mrs. Pike," he said. "Martin." He stood there, ruined by relief, and rebuilt by it in the same second. "Thank you for not naming me. Thank you for standing when it mattered." That was all. It was enough. Jonas found her next, moving slower than usual because the bruised ribs still protested. "Hale would have liked today," he said. "He would have said it should have happened 20 years sooner." Jonas almost smiled. That too. Spring returned to Slate Run with indecent energy. By the time Eleanor rode back under federal protection in February, the orchard buds had begun to tighten. The lower creek ran full from snowmelt, and the farmhouse stood stripped of furniture but not dignity. Blackthorn's men had taken chairs, tools, stored grain, and what copper they could pry loose. They had not taken stone walls, well water, or the habits Sam built into the land with his own hands. Those things remained, and they were enough to begin. Harlan Mote came to the gate in March, carrying a crate of nails, and a hoe he pretended not to know she needed. He stood outside the fence until Eleanor crossed the yard. "I told them you'd asked questions," he said, looking at his boots. "I was afraid. That's the truth of it. Ugly truth, but truth." Eleanor measured the man before her. Old, ashamed, late, but present. "I need somebody who knows where Sam kept the fence staples," she said. "You coming in or apologizing from the road all day?" Harlan's mouth bent at one corner like gratitude had surprised him. He came through the gate. Ruth Halley arrived 2 weeks later, with yeast bread wrapped in clean linen and a face that carried its own punishment. "I had no right to doubt you," she said. "You had children to think about. That is not the same as courage." "No," Eleanor said. "But it's not the same as malice either. I need help with the South Orchard, if you've brought strong opinions and working hands." Ruth laughed once, half broken and half relieved, and followed her inside. Jonas Creed came in April, on his way north with news from Knoxville. Federal prosecutors were widening their review. More families had begun filing claims. 2 county officers were under inquiry. And in one appellate note already circulating through the circuit, Judge Porter's language on widows' standing had been cited as persuasive authority. "It's a crack, not a revolution," Jonas said on the porch with coffee between them. "Cracks are where walls start telling the truth." He lifted his cup to that. In May a letter came from Nashville, in Lydia Rowan's steady hand. Her mother wrote that women she had never met were asking whether the Pike ruling might help them challenge estates, liens, vanished transfers, railroad claims. She wrote that if Eleanor wished to spend any part of the coming winter in the city, reviewing papers and advising on cases, a desk would be waiting. At the bottom, in a line pressed harder than the rest, Lydia wrote, "I am proud of the exactness with which you carried both grief and truth." Eleanor read that sentence 3 times before placing the letter inside the leather deed case beside Sam's note and Gideon Hale's journal extracts. Adelaide Crowe visited in June. She had recovered her mill-in-law, though not yet in profit, and she and Eleanor spent a whole afternoon discussing forms, affidavits, storage methods, witness coaching, county records, and the practical problem of how frightened people could be persuaded to preserve copies before theft arrived wearing official language. By evening they had the beginnings of something not yet formal, but already real, a network of letters, copies, trusted clerks, and women willing to hold papers for one another when men or companies tried to make records disappear. It was not a movement yet. It was a method. That was better. On a warm July afternoon, Eleanor climbed back to the survey tower above Iron Spur. The roof was no less broken. The pines no less patient. The hollow in the hearth where she unearthed the strongbox had already begun filling with wind-blown dust. From the threshold she could see, far off, the edge of Slate Run. Orchard Rose, Creek Flash, Stonehouse, and the repaired fence line Harlan finished in April. Small at that distance. Solid, anyway. They had told her widows should yield to paper. Other companies were simply too large to fight. They had told her records belonged to offices, and offices belonged to men. Nobody told her truth could survive 30 years in iron under a hearthstone, and still come out sharper than the hands that buried it. Nobody told her a dead man's careful copies, a frightened clerk's conscience, a missing auditor's journal, and a widow trained to read pressure marks could bring down a company built on polite theft. The sun dropped west in long bronze bands through the pines. Eleanor Pike, owner restored, wife bereaved, daughter of a records examiner, woman who now knew that paper could be a weapon in the right hands and a shield in the same moment, sat on the broken threshold until the first evening star appeared. Then she rose and walked down the mountain toward the house. There was lamplight in the kitchen window. Ruth was there, going over accounts. Harlan's mule stood hitched by the fence, where he had stayed late to mend the south gate. Inside the house waited ledgers, seedlings, letters from strangers, and work not yet finished. Eleanor carried the leather deed case in both arms as she descended, not like a burden anymore, but like something living people were meant to pass forward. Behind her, the old tower darkened against the sky. Ahead of her, the lamp burned steady, and between those 2 points, in the July air above Slate Run, Eleanor understood at last that survival was only the first half of the story. The second half was what you taught other people to save.